live on YouTube.
Where are you located right now, Christian?
I'm in Eden Prairie.
Oh, is your home?
Yeah, I'm at home.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. We have a standing desk that we brought in, so it's switched around the room a little bit. So, all right. Well, awesome. So I gave you a couple of these two questions here. What are you hopeful for? What are you hopeful for in the coming year? You didn't necessarily have to answer both, but I hope that they prodded some good conversation. So I think a lot of you are muted, but some of you are not. So if you want to share, please be sure to unmute yourself. But what were some of the things that you discussed or came up with in your groups?
Our group had, of course, the virus injections and the control of that, and civility in our country, probably the world, and the return of choral music.
Yes.
A real choir person.
That's right.
Our group was very similar to what Peggy said. Probably number one is the divisiveness in our country, and this idea that we've got two camps and they can't quite get along. And the second is obviously getting control of the virus and allowing ourselves to reopen our daily lives, to intermingling with other people and being participants in things we want to do.
Amen. All right, others, any other things that were brought in? It looked like Sally, looks like you were sitting up. Did you want to share something? I think you're muted, Sally.
Actually, I was just changing my setting. So sorry.
No, that's okay. No problem. All right. Well, any other thoughts folks want to share in terms of hopes and dreams for the new year? All right. Well, all of those are great. If those two things that have been mentioned multiple times were to happen, it would feel like maybe the kingdom had come, and getting choral music back would be like a cherry on top. So, so I think we all can pretty much jive with both of those big hopes, and especially with bringing back choral music.
Christian,
yeah.
there is one thing. That's just for this year, but we do have a bigger hope.
Right.
That perhaps the world itself does not have.
Indeed.
And that's important to keep in mind, that we have a hope that is stronger and bigger than COVID and divisiveness, and so.
Amen. And I think that's absolutely right. And seeing even our smaller, kind of more penultimate hopes connected to that ultimate hope is important. So thank you for that. That's right. Our hope in Jesus, our hope in the gospel, and in God's promise to transform and renew the earth. Right. Yes, amen. All right, so I'm sharing my screen now, and we will start there. So this was our opening conversation and comment. So I thought it would be worthwhile just quickly to remind us sort of where we are, since we haven't met for a few weeks. Kind of where are we in the story we've been telling. And I'm just going to do this super overview, right? We went through the prologue many weeks ago, right, which are the first 4 verses that introduced us and set us up for understanding Luke's sort of agenda and goals in the telling of the story of Jesus, as well as to some extent the methods that he wanted to use. We then have a section that we travel through, which are not one but two different infancy narratives, obviously concerned with the birth and infancy of Jesus, his annunciation, etc., with Mary, much of which, of course, we rehearsed during Advent and Christmas. But there was also the narrative of John the Baptist, his kinsman. And then we have a section after that that's we might sometimes call it, sometimes it's called the preparatory section. It includes Jesus's baptism, but also very importantly, his going out into the wilderness to be tested and tried. And now we have entered into a section that is sometimes called the section around the Galilee, so the Galilean ministry. This is a section that we're kind of smack dab, I suppose we could say, in the middle of, because we are towards the end now of chapter 5. It begins with the inauguration of Jesus's ministry in Nazareth, and then progresses from there into Capernaum. And then once we actually get into chapters 5 and 6, which is where we are now, one of the unique things about this section, or so maybe it's, I don't know if it's unique, but yeah, it's worth noting, is that there's not a ton of location in terms of time and even place, other than that we probably are still in the Galilee. But oftentimes some of the episodes are introduced with once, one time Jesus was doing this, or once he was doing that. And so there's a little bit more, the precision here is Luke doesn't appear to be quite as interested in. So that's kind of where we are. And let's turn now, and we will, the other thing I think we probably should note before I do this is that we've noticed in those first chapters, certainly those first 3 to 4 chapters, the genuinely good news, right? The announcement to Mary and her affirmation of that, the song that Mary sings, right? The raising up of the lowly, the setting free of the captives, the different stories, right, with the shepherds coming to visit Jesus, all these extraordinary things, women, and the prominence of women, right, which is truly remarkable given the time we're talking about. And so there's just, and then of course you come to the announcement, basically the scene in chapter 4 when Jesus, at least in Luke's telling, publicly inaugurates or begins his ministry. And he reads a passage out of the prophet Isaiah, all right, which talks about the Jubilee year. And so Jubilee is sort of a theme that seems to shape who Jesus is and what he's about, right? Setting free the captives, proclaiming the year of the Lord's favor, release, etc., healing of the blind. And then flowing out of that, we see Jesus doing precisely those things, all right? So good news. But we also start to see resistance to that news, right? And this is already there from the beginning, but it's a minor key, and it's not as prominent, right? I mean, already at the very start, we have the prophet Simeon talking about, Jesus's ministry is going to result in the rising and the falling of many. And so now, as we are getting particularly, and of course we have the Nazareth scene, which is one of the most aggressive of certainly in the early part of the Gospels, where they initially receive his announcement and his news seemingly positively, and by the end of the episode, they're ready to throw him off a cliff, right? And so that theme of resistance now is starting to pick up, and there's a particular sort of cadre or group that we might describe, I think, as the religious elite, and they will sometimes be described as Pharisees, sometimes as scribes, teachers of the law, And of course, eventually we'll hear about another group, a faction known as the Sadducees. And each of these groups certainly has a kind of historical connection and a certain set of historical interests. But that's all of that just to give a sense of context in terms of where we are.
Has somebody got Bowser whimpering in there?
No, give me 1 second, please. Just a second. Can we do something with that ball? Because it keeps picking up. I got a guy who's like.
Don't get
All right.
shame.
Okay, squeaky ball is off. All right, so can I get a volunteer then, picking up here on our passage, someone who's willing to read our opening?
Well, I'll start.
Okay.
Then they said to him, John's disciples, like the disciples of the Pharisees, frequently fast and pray, but your disciples eat and drink. Jesus said to them, you cannot make wedding guests fast while the bridegroom is with them, can you? The days will come when the bridegroom will be taken away from them, and then they will fast in those days. He also told them a parable. No one tears a piece of new garment and sews it on an old garment. Otherwise, the new one will be torn, and the piece from the new will not match the old. And no one puts new wine into old wineskins. Therefore, the new wine will burst the skins and will be spilled, and the skins will be destroyed. But the new wine must be put into fresh wineskins, and no one after drinking old wine desires new wine, but says, the old is good.
All right. So we begin now to encounter, right, the Pharisees becoming kind of more and more sort of interested in picking at Jesus and his legitimacy. And this scene is a component of that. There's a few things here that I can talk about in terms of our verses here, 33 through 39. Effectively, number one, we have two different sort of parables, right? One of them around wedding feasts and having a bridegroom present. And then the other around with two images in the second set of parables. So there really in some ways are three, one having to do with the repair of an old garment and the other having to do with new wine in old wineskins. All of these are meant to drive home, I would suggest, two things. One is the newness of what Jesus is about, the newness, the new thing that is happening, the unique thing. And I'm going to use a word later that you'll see on the screen, novum. And novum is just a sort of Latin word. It's a theological term, but it's meant to drive home the kind of profoundly unique new reality that the gospel and that Jesus really represents. And the other thing then flows out of the first, and that is that this new reality is in a sense disruptive of the old reality, right? So all these images that you're going to see as we kind of walk through, there's going to be a kind of disruptive element at play, at least the way that Jesus interprets this. So in verse 33, right? So then they said to him, John's disciples, like the disciples of the Pharisees, frequently fast and pray, but your disciples eat and drink. So one way I think that we can view this is a complaint in a sense. And I think a good way of interpreting this is that the Pharisees are looking on the Jesus movement and on Jesus. And they're saying, in a sense, you guys look like a typical religious movement, and yet you don't look like a typical religious movement, right? You're not keeping the normal religious observances. That's what the fasting and the praying piece is about, right? Because that would be the normal thing. that you would keep, you would be known to practice in a sense. There's also, of course, here the backdrop, the kind of historical backdrop of the complaint, John's disciples. And I think we've mentioned several different times that it does appear that one of the things that that Luke, the author of this gospel, is concerned with is addressing the difference between John's ministry and Jesus's ministry, and potentially trying to convince maybe contemporaries of Luke who are still only disciples of John that even that is not enough, that they need now to join Jesus. And I think we see that, to me, the most explicit of those occurs in the book of Acts, where one of the apostles comes upon disciples of John who have only received the baptism of John, but not yet have been baptized in the Holy Spirit. But there's been several little pieces here. So I think that's where they're coming from when they raise this question, and the reason why John's disciples become the comparative point. The whole thing, though, I think, though, can be rooted in this basic point here. One of the things that I think is also important, and this is, I was really put onto this in some ways when we studied the book of John together, and that is that Jesus is not so much interested in rejecting certain religious practices. Rather, he's interested in thinking about what is their purpose, right? In this case, of course, timing and purpose is what I have here, but it's especially purpose. And we're going to see this, I would say it's here under the surface, but when we get into the very next scene, which is around the Sabbath, the purpose question is going to be at the fore. Like, what is the purpose of the law? What is the purpose of these religious observances? What is the purpose of doing, like, keeping Sabbath? It's not just the ritual. At least that's the kind of the message that we get from Jesus. He doesn't reject necessarily keep doing these practices, but he does reject the way in which his interlocutors appear to have kind of misunderstood the reasoning, rationale, or purpose. The preceding interchange, right? When we put this together, as I've already mentioned, and you've already kind of encountered this to a certain extent, this really kind of is the backdrop for my earlier comments about where we are in the flow of our story, in which we start to see the Pharisees becoming more and more suspicious and accusatory to a certain extent. The specificity here, as I say, when you put the two scenes together, what you find is an accusation, right, that Jesus's company is not serious enough, right? It's too jovial. So how does he respond? He responds, first of all, with this remarkable illustration, right? The wedding feast illustration, which starts in verse 34. Jesus said to them, "You cannot make wedding guests fast while the bridegroom is with them, can you? The days will come when the bridegroom will be taken away from them, and then they will fast in those days." So now, again, we kind of hit on this disruptive presence of the kingdom, and we have these two examples. The first one being the wedding feast. Now, what's the backdrop here? I've been, I think, persuaded to a certain extent by some commentators who would argue that in sort of Jewish tradition, a wedding and the possibility of a wedding trumps or displaces something like a funeral, right? And that's sort of the idea, right? So in Jews, it says here in the outline, in Jewish tradition, mourning, fasting, and other acts of penance were supposed to be set aside in the face of a bridal party. And the reason for this is, I think, because a bridal party, because of its joyfulness, was understood as something that disrupted the day-to-day. And part of the day-to-day was fasting, praying, mourning, etc., right? Because death is part of the cycle of life. And so there's a kind of underlying assumption about perhaps certain Jewish expectations that seems, I think, to make a little bit more sense of this. What's the point? The point, of course, obviously in the example, who's the bridegroom? The bridegroom is Jesus, right? His presence, which is not going to be permanent, at least not in the way that it is, because eventually, obviously, he's going to leave. He's going to be crucified, raised, and then ascended. And he'll be present in a different way in the outpouring of the Spirit, but he'll not be present in quite the same way. But the point is that while he's with them, why would you go around mourning and fasting and praying? Because what you've been waiting for is here, right? What you've been longing for is present. It's the day, right? And any of you who've been either either have been married, gone through a marriage ceremony, or have been to a friend's ceremony, right? You know that there's a kind of a lot of expectations and preparations, but then once you get to the day, it's like riding a roller coaster. I mean, once the day starts, that's it. You know, you might as well just hop on and hang on and enjoy yourself as best as you're able. So I think that's kind of the background imagery that he's kind of working with here. And it's this notion, right, on a wedding day, to a certain extent, that the normal practices are suspended, right? And so that's sort of the process here. The other things, the other practices of fasting and praying, and maybe we might put other things in there like meditating on scripture, et cetera, et cetera. There'll be time for that later, is sort of the point. Right now, though, is the time to attend to the things that Jesus is attending to, right? Which is embracing sinners, healing those who are afflicted, and setting free those who are captive, right? So that's kind of the imagery here. And of course, what does that mean? Well, it means that disrupts what we might call the regular religious economy that these figures are used to, right? And so this is what I meant, I guess, a few weeks ago when I talked about the disruptive power of the gospel, its ability to sort of change and challenge us in ways that we don't always expect. So that is example number one. Let's turn then to the second example, which sort of drives the point home in some ways, I think, even more clearly. And maybe we might even say ups the ante a little bit, like intensifies the point that Jesus is trying to make. So he's starting in verse 36. He also told them a parable. No one tears a piece from a new garment and sews it on an old garment. Otherwise, the new will be torn, and the piece from the new will not match the old. And no one puts new wine into old wineskins, otherwise the new wine will burst the skins and will be spilled, and the skins will be destroyed. But new wine must be put into fresh wineskins. And no one, after drinking old wine, desires new wine, but says the old is good. That last verse is kind of an interesting one, but you could even stop there, and I'll come back to that one in just a moment, because I think there's a couple of different ways of interpreting it. So our second example then, so these are two sets of examples that kind of fit together, both of which are meant to address sort of the underlying question, in a sense, that the Pharisees are putting to Jesus, but also it addresses their expectations, right? They expect Jesus, they expect certain things of Jesus, and he's doing something remarkably, radically different, right? So the new garment and the new wine, right? Both of these are images that people would have been familiar with, right? As I say here, both of them work with a certain kind of common sense. The first one is, why destroy both the old and the new garment? The old material, it can't accommodate the new material. And if you do that, then you why not just wear the new garment? I think is sort of the point, right? Why take a piece from the new, put it on the old, and watch it not work with the old, and you've destroyed both of the garments, right? So there's something, in other words, there's something new going on here, and one needs to change one's clothes. I mean, I think is a way of thinking about it. The same thing, and I think the second image is probably the clearest in terms of the parable, and that is this image of new and old wineskins, right? New wine, because of its fermentation, the power of it, it cannot be contained in an old wineskin, because an old wineskin would be too flexible, right? Having held wine for a very long time, and it potentially would burst. Or no, I guess it says inflexible. Sorry. So it's not able to hold. So what's the point? The point, of course, is that in both images, the new wine and the new garment, these are the things that Jesus himself represents, right? Jesus is the new reality who disrupts the old. And in both cases, it's the new thing that actually potentially could destroy the old thing, right? So particularly the second one, it's the new wine that has the ability to burst the old wineskin, the thing that held it. So as we get back to, right, those practices that they're asking Jesus about, and as I say here in the second or the last clause on my presentation here, it should not surprise us that his disciples, or should not surprise the others that his disciples do not act according to old established categories, right? So the old categories, the old assumptions, the old expectations, because of the radical new thing that Jesus is about, it's going to be on some level incomprehensible, right? And that's sort of the point. Now, what about this last verse? And no one after drinking old wine desires new wine, but says the old is good. This is kind of this is not just a statement. It's a warning. At least this is the way I think this makes the most sense, at least from the commentators that I've looked at. And the idea is don't just allow yourself to be captured and enamored with the old wine so that you can't receive the new, right? As I say here in the outline, Jesus, Jesus hasn't rejected all the old patterns, but he does issue a kind of warning that the old patterns have their use and are good, but don't be so committed to those old patterns that you can't receive a new pattern, right? That you can't receive a new reality. And I think that's sort of the basic overarching point of this section. So let me stop there for a second and see if there are some comments or questions from folks.
Just the parable of no one puts their hand to the plow and looks back when they're plowing. They plow ahead. And I saw some parallels to kind of like you have to stay with the new, and as opposed to going back to the old.
Right. You're not typically going to look back, right? You're going to look forward in order to keep the plow steady and keep the line straight, in a sense. At least that's the way that image works with. And it's a similar kind of, I think that's a similar kind of imagery here to what Jesus is doing. I think of the three examples, of course, the one that seems to make the most sense, or sort of is the most straightforward, is the new wine and old wineskin imagery, that there is something radically new happening. Not a rejection, not a fundamental rejection of the old, but simply saying that the old forms and patterns cannot contain the new. And so you're going to need new forms and patterns, in a sense. So I think that's another way that we could maybe put this.
So why do we pay attention to the Old Testament?
Say more, Elgin. That's a good question.
Well, we call it the Old Testament and the New Testament. The new is not appropriate for the old, so why do we worry about it? We pay a lot of attention to the Old Testament.
Yeah, I think again, this gets back to Jesus doesn't reject the practices, right? The old practices. He simply says, don't be so enamored of them. Don't have your allegiance so deeply tied to them that you can't see the new. And that what I think that underlines, that I think what that sort of implies, that's not said straightforwardly, is that there is a connection between the old and the new. And we certainly get that in other places in Jesus's, he doesn't come to abolish the law and the prophets, but rather to fulfill them, right? So we don't get a kind of outright rejection of the old, but rather that there is place both for the old and the new. But right now, what Jesus himself seems to be identifying with is the new.
But if you can't put new wine into an old wineskin, that sounds like a rejection of the old.
I think it's just a rejection that an old wineskin is only good for old wine. Right? If you have old wine, and you need to move it from one other old wineskin into another old wineskin, that works. Right? I mean, remember these are parables, right? These are illustrations, which are all of them eventually break down at some point.
Okay.
But I think these are legit questions because the question you're actually asking, Elgin, comes up in the history of the church, right? In which people are like, well, why do we bother to listen to the Old Testament? And we have early movements in the history of the church that literally just want to reject the Old Testament. They want to get rid of it because they think it doesn't have any value. And I think Protestants also have struggled with this question because Luther had a certain kind of bent in that direction. And there are other Protestant groups as well, like say in the Anabaptist tradition, where they especially are primarily interested in the New Testament. And the Old Testament is very much as a secondary reality. So this is not the question you're scratching at, I don't think is illegitimate. I guess I'm giving you all those illustrations to show that it is a perennial question, right? And to emphasize the newness of Jesus does raise the question of the status of the old. And it doesn't really, I'm not sure that it really goes away.
And of course, it's in the Hebrew Bible that we even have the introduction of the New Testament, the New Covenant.
Right. I mean, I think you find that there are ligaments and connections and things of that nature. That's right.
And also, if you're going through, say, like the book of Hebrews, where every other word is a reference back to the Old Testament, you would have a hard time understanding it.
Right. And obviously Jesus himself starts his ministry with a quotation from the Old Testament. So remember that this is, again, this is a parable.
With the new wine and the old wine, we're sort of looking at that right now with the possibility of renaming our church.
Sure. Yeah, that could be very much there could be something here to hear, right? That we have new challenges, we have a new context, we have new opportunities, and so maybe we need to be thinking about a new wineskin, right? Something of that nature. That could be very much a way of interpreting how this might apply there.
Well, I guess for me, the history is important. And the Jewish people always look back to see how God had taken care of them. And I think for us in the New Testament, it's important to see God's action and God's history. And then I also think Jesus is wanting to give freedom. He's wanting to focus on the love part of the history and the love part of what we are called to do. Even the Pharisees, if you love the idea of a wedding, you want to do it with right. You maybe want to put in a little history, but for me, I guess the Old Testament is history, and it's rich with the Psalms and the Proverbs, and I guess and Jesus was Jewish, so obviously he's going to bring that forth. But he is bringing a new freedom.
Yeah, and I think one way we could think about the construction of the canon is that the old looks forward and the new looks back, right? That both of them are looking at the person of Jesus. At least this is how a Christian might render an understanding. The New Testament obviously is written and collected after Jesus has died and been raised, and so therefore, in a sense, we can say it looks back to Jesus. It's a recollection. They were originally called the Memoirs of the Apostles by some of the earliest church fathers, whereas the Old Testament looks forward, right? It anticipates. It's looking towards the promises being fulfilled, etc. And of course, the two testaments are bound together quite profoundly, particularly on the side of the New Testament. And what I mean by that is that the New Testament is the one that is constantly quoting the Old and is constantly in dialogue with the Old, whereas the Old can't do that yet, right? Because the New hasn't been written. And so, yeah, we don't want to push this. I don't want us to push this too far. But Elgin, you did put your finger, I think, on an important question. So
I have another thought. In communion, we're asked to remember, but we take communion to go forth new.
yeah, right. Yeah, communion actually it is a compression of the past, present, and future, right? To remember his death, right? To proclaim it until he comes, right? And so this sense of that forward looking, that and as you said, you look back and you're nourished to go forth. I think that's another awesome, great way of stating that. Absolutely. Other comments or questions? This definitely sparked some good conversation here.
As we're thinking about the whole concept of the wedding and the bridegroom and such, there is the thought tied in with that of and communion, that the bridegroom, that the fiance, as we would call him,
Did you say Beyonce?
no, the fiance.
Yeah, no, I'm not.
When they're at their engagement, will drink a cup, and they'll say, I won't drink of this cup again until I meet you again. And then he goes off to build the house. Usually tied to his father's house. So a lot of these traditions of what occurred during the wedding or during the wedding engagement tie back to John's chapter 14 verses and such. But all these wedding things are very interesting when you see them in those light.
Yes.
Even the communion cup. Yeah.
All right. Well, let me move us forward then. This is great conversation. Let's see here. All right. Can I get a volunteer who's willing to read our next passage?
I can do that.
Okay. Thanks, Kirby.
One Sabbath, while Jesus was going through the grain fields, his disciples plucked some heads of grain, rubbed them in their hands, and ate them. But some of the Pharisees said, "Why are you doing what is not lawful on the Sabbath?" And Jesus answered, "Have you not read what David did when he and his companions were hungry? He entered the house of God and took and ate the bread of the presence, which is not lawful for any but the priests to eat, and gave some to his companions. Then he said to them, 'The Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath.'"
Okay. So now we transition a little bit, though there is a connection, obviously, to what we've heard in our last little episode, particularly given the imagery of the bridegroom, right? So just keep that in mind, and I'll kind of try to hit on that every now and then. So we just read through chapter 6, verses 1 through 5, but this fits together with the next passage that we're going to read in just a minute too. So it doesn't just end here, and these two passages kind of go together. They both deal with the issue of Sabbath and Sabbath observance. And of course, both of them continue to show the rising hostility and resistance to Jesus, especially from the religious authorities, because those are the ones that sort of become the interlocutors and the inquirers, I suppose, inquisitors of Jesus. The distinction, just like to some extent what we heard in the parables, at least the way that we were trying to interpret the parables, now kind of comes out onto the surface of the interaction. And I think we could say it's something like that the Pharisees are asking after issues of religious observance, whereas Jesus is consistently interested in the underlying purpose. Like, what's the real, and I think what we could say here is that Jesus raises the question, what is the heart of the law? Right? What is really the heart of the Sabbath? What is the heart of keeping certain religious observances? Why do we do that? Do we do it just to do it? Do we do it just to appear holy and pious? Why are we doing these things? I think is one way we might think about sort of a question that's being kind of wrestled with here. And I think the answer is going to become that the reason that we do these things is because they are supposed to be life-giving, right? And if something is not life-giving, right, that becomes sort of the heart of it. What gives life? And I think that would be the answer, in a sense, that Jesus might give. So let's kind of engage through some of this. So verses 1 through 2. One Sabbath, while Jesus was going through the grain fields, his disciples plucked some heads of grain, rubbed them in their hands, and ate them. But some of the Pharisees said, "Why are you doing what is not lawful on the Sabbath?" So, number one, I would just want to note that as I was kind of reading through and prepping for, kind of to lead us through this conversation, I did notice, and 2 or 3 different commentators mentioned that there is a kind of a history of maybe we might say division or confusion over what exactly is at issue in this particular scene. And I'll try to make it kind of clear a little bit of sort of the factors that they raise to say that this is what makes it unclear. The first is the fact that that there are passages in the Old Testament, and there are passages, particularly in rabbinic exegesis, that is sort of somewhat contemporary to Jesus, that indicates that it actually might be okay to do something that one might consider unlawful on certain, like on a Sabbath, especially if you need food, right? So for instance, one interpreter said that the law seems to allow for people who are poor and hungry to go into a field if they need food, if they don't have food, and to glean some of that food, as long as they are not taking it home to preserve it, right? As long as they are just gleaning it to eat it there, right? So, and that seems to be the scene here, right? And the other factor that sort of shows up, but no one really seems to know what to do with it, is the issue of the fact that Jesus and his disciples are walking on the Sabbath, which also doesn't appear, it typically is not something that's allowable. But the irony, of course, is that the Pharisees are also walking on the Sabbath, right? So that's the other piece of this. They appear to be going through the grain fields and watching what Jesus and his disciples are doing as well. So they are kind of engaged in what might otherwise be considered to a certain extent to be unlawful. So it's not, my point is, I suppose, in this is that in terms of some of the details here, there's a fair amount of disagreement, but I do think that if we pull back from a lot of the details, that we can get an overall sensibility, both from this passage and the next one, about what Luke is trying to convey. So we get verses 1 through 2. right? Why are you doing what is not lawful on the Sabbath is where verse 2 ends. And then Jesus gives his answer. Jesus answered, have you not read what David did when he and his companions were hungry? He entered the house of God and took and ate the bread of the presence, which it is not lawful for any but the priests to eat, and gave some to his companions. Right? So here is Jesus in a sense, and again, this shows up in other rabbinic exegesis, by the way. So this is not super controversial. And it's one of those instances where you can say that everything that Jesus said, you could find in the teachings of other rabbis in one way or another. And so this is certainly one of those places. So what does it say? It says, this scene is understood by many, though not all, as an instance where the law is being suspended for the purpose of giving life. Another significant instance of that has to do with circumcision, right? So if you have a child who, right, every child is supposed to be circumcised on the 8th day. If your child is born on a Friday and you get to the next Sabbath, you can still suspend Sabbath regulations, which typically would say you're not supposed to do anything, and have your child circumcised. Why? Because circumcision was understood to be a sign of the covenant, which is, of course, understood to be a life-giving thing. So you could suspend certain regulations of the law in order to do other things that not only were understood to be lawful, but understood to be life-giving. Right? And I think that's kind of the difference here, because in the case of eating the bread of the presence, it's life-giving and not just lawful. So what's the point? I think the point of this passage and the point of the next passage, and this is something that we hear in the letters of Paul and others, and that is, what is the purpose of the law, or what is the purpose of Sabbath observance here? And if you read the other gospel stories, they include a quote that Luke actually leaves out, which is the quote, man was not made for the Sabbath, but the Sabbath for man. That doesn't appear here, but it does appear in Mark and it does appear in Matthew around the same scene. So what's the point? The Sabbath and the law is meant to give life and not to take it away. And one of the issues between Jesus and the Pharisees appears to be this issue of using the law to give life as opposed to dealing out death. And I don't think we get quite as many absolute contrasts as we do in something, say, like the Gospel of John, where I do think we get much more pronounced contrasts, but the same basic sort of dynamic seems to be at play. Then we have this very last verse, which is important both for this scene and the next scene. Then he said to them, the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath, right? And this is maybe a way of restating a generalized principle, the one that I mentioned that shows up in Mark, which is that the Sabbath was made for man and not man for the Sabbath. But rather than it being stated as a generalized principle, it actually brings it back to the point that Jesus was making earlier about the bridegroom. It puts it in his person. And that means, in a sense, that, I mean, one way we could take this, the significance of this is to understand that Jesus doesn't come, it's not the message that Jesus brings that's the point. It's that Jesus is the point, right? Like and that the message, in a sense, flows out of his person, and that's what makes it important. So it's not the principle per se, it's rather that the principle comes from, it's where the principle comes from, I guess, right? That's the most important. And so attending to the person of Jesus, attending to who he is and what he does, that's what then gives meaning and context and power, we might say, to the things that he says, right? As opposed to the things that he says, giving meaning, context, and power to the person he is. So this at least is, I would say that this seems to me to be Luke's sort of overarching point, right? That the Son of, and this claim, of course, is a sort of ruling claim, right? That the Son of Man is the one who determines, in a sense, what the purpose of the Sabbath is. And remember, Son of Man, here's a term, just as a reminder, that comes out of the book of Daniel. It's an eschatological term, which means it's at the end times kind of term. It's Jesus's favorite title for himself. And I think especially importantly for this particular passage, what is the function of the Son of Man in the book of Daniel? It is to render judgment. So it's in other words, right, the Son of Man has prerogative. The Son of Man is the one who is going to render judgment as to what the purpose of the Sabbath is, right? So the Son of Man is truly the Lord of the Sabbath. That's sort of the essence of what he's saying. It's not, in a sense, I think it's what we could take from this. Let me stop there and see what kind of comments or questions you might have before I flip us to our next scene.
It's just that the Son of Man can be interpreted two ways. One is the Daniel 7 passage, and the other way is just generically, human beings are the Lord of the Sabbath. But I think,
yeah, I think the latter is not. I would say the latter is a. I don't think it fits contextually, but I agree
Right.
that there are other. I think you're right that there are other folks who have pushed that. But yeah, go ahead. I'm sorry, Tom.
No, that's and that's why you can do man was made for the Sabbath and not Sabbath was made for man and not for man for the Sabbath.
Right.
There are close parallels there.
That's true. That's true.
But they're saying something about Jesus in this passage.
That's right. That's right. The
Yeah.
point is that he's at the center in that regard. Yeah. Other comments or questions on this? I mean, I think what you take away from this is, I mean, maybe questions that one takes away from this are, what are some things that we do, religious kinds of things that we do, or things that we hold dear? And I don't know if you have certain habits that you hold dear, but maybe it's worth revisiting why you do those. We just went through a period in the year, typically in the church year, but also in our private, personal lives, where we dust off certain traditions and we do certain things. Right? We decorate the house, we bring a tree in, we make certain foods, right? And maybe this year in particular, what was driven home was that the reason that we do those things is because they're life-giving. But maybe at other times in our lives, we just did them because they were expected, and this is just what had to happen, right? But I think this is the kind of scene that can push us to think about, why is it that we do certain things? What makes them important? And I think the question is does it give life to us, right? Maybe that's a way of thinking about how this might apply.
Did these laws of the Sabbath come from God?
Yes. I mean, at least the Sabbath, most of the Sabbath expectations and observances that seem to be at play, at least, are found in Torah.
Okay.
Did you want to say more about the background of your question, Elgin? Because you have a good way of opening up cans of worms. So I want to hear what you got in there.
No, I think I'll mute myself.
Oh, come on, Elgin.
No, I was just wondering, are these man-made laws and meant to be broken or evaluated? Are they God's laws and they're things that we should not break?
Well, I think in this particular case, the specific laws that seem to be at issue here are laws that are rooted in the text of the Old Testament. And I think part of the argument that maybe Jesus is making, if this is sort of a textual argument, is that God gave these laws not just to be obeyed. God gave these because they're meant to give life. And here's example one, that if somehow the legal requirement keeps you from having access to life, it can be suspended so that you can have access to life. Like
Okay.
that could be a sort of a way of navigating it.
We certainly don't follow these now.
No, I mean, I think this is part of that history of the Christian church, right? Of sort of wrestling through, and even over the last few hundred years, right? I mean, I'm not just talking about over the 2,000 years, because we used to have very strong Sabbath, like Sabbatarian movement, and Sabbatarianism did have an argument around making sure that working people had a minute to breathe, right? That they didn't exist just to work. And I think one of the reasons for sort of some of the Sabbatarian movements in like the 17th, 18th, 19th century was it was a way of giving respite to working people in the face of industrialization, right? Where working conditions and the possibility of being working 24/7 was actually real. Whereas earlier, it would have been harder because you didn't have electricity and et cetera. So
Good, thank you.
But
Yeah.
also Elgin brings up a good point in that there's, first of all, just, God says to honor the Sabbath, and the Pharisees say, well, how shall we honor the Sabbath? And so they put fences around what you can and cannot do so that you won't violate the Sabbath.
right, that's right. And we're going to hear that, like we hear that actually explicitly, right, from Jesus, right? You build fences and guardrails and make it harder and harder and harder for the average person to gain access to what the Sabbath is supposed to represent, in a sense.
And you see that with Jesus, in the Sermon on the Mount where he says, you've heard don't kill. Well, I say don't even be angry with your brother. Well, that's putting a fence around that commandment so you don't violate that commandment.
Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy.
Right, that's right. Keep it set apart. All right, let's transition then to the next passage, which is connected. I think probably this will be our last portion of text, but let me get a volunteer, if I can, to read this.
I'll do it.
Okay.
On another Sabbath, he entered the synagogue and taught. And there was a man there whose right hand was withered. The scribes and the Pharisees watched to see whether he would cure on the Sabbath, so that they might find an accusation against him. Even though he knew what they were thinking, he said to the man who had the withered hand, "Come and stand here." He got up and stood there. Then Jesus said to them, "I ask you, is it lawful to do good or to do harm on the Sabbath, to save life or to destroy it?" After looking around at all of them, he said to him, "Stretch out your hand." He did so, and his hand was restored. But they were filled with fury and discussed with one another what they might do to Jesus.
All right, so now I do think now we can say that we have moved from the exceptional to a certain extent the pushing of the boundaries, and maybe even to the transgressive is a potential way of thinking about this. You obviously it's connected, right? Because we have this is occurring on a Sabbath. It has to do with what is lawful on the Sabbath, et cetera. So you can see how it's connected to the earlier scene. So verses 6-7, on another Sabbath, he entered the synagogue and taught, and there was a man there whose right hand was withered. The scribes and the Pharisees watched him to see whether he would cure on the Sabbath, so that they might find an accusation against him. So this is one of the first times, by the way, in the story that we hear that description. All right. And so that's an important thing to note. That means at least in terms of the drama, we're starting to turn that corner. So, and it's an intensification, right? So as I just mentioned, that we're moving from what feels like exceptions to the law to now Jesus doing something that is very definitely out of the ordinary, though it does have some precedence, and I'll try my best to sort of highlight what that might look like. So Pharisees definitely keen to discredit Jesus in these verses, and the other just comment is the importance of the fact that the withered hand on this man is not his left hand, but it's his right hand. And I know that there may be folks on our screen who are lefties. I have a lefty in my family. My son is a lefty. My father-in-law is a lefty. But in the ancient world, it was very definitely a right-handed world. All right, and the right hand had symbolic sort of it carried symbolic weight. And I think one of the things that in a sense is trying to be communicated here is that not only does this guy have a withered hand, he probably can't work, right? So his status in the community is precarious because of his withered hand, because it's a right hand, right? And so this is a small detail, but there's a lot of weight here at play in regards to this. So when Jesus heals this guy, he's not just getting rid of or taking care of a disability. He's actually restoring this guy to his community, right? So the life-giving element here is pretty huge. So we turn then in verse 8, right? Even though he knew what they were thinking, he said to the man who had the withered hand, "Come and stand here." He got up and stood there. So Jesus is going to take the initiative, and he's going to, and here as I take on this image, he's going to push the boundaries, right? And essentially, he's going to burst, to some extent, the categories of the Pharisees, right? If you take this imagery of the old wine, right? We're about to have new wine poured into an old wineskin, at least in terms of their minds, because he's taking on their assumptions about what the Sabbath is really about. Then we get verses 9 and 10, which sort of constitutes sort of the crux of the scene. Then Jesus said to them, "I ask you, is it lawful to do good or to do harm on the Sabbath, to save life or to destroy it?" After looking around at all of them, he said to them, "Stretch out your hand." He did so, and his hand was restored, right? So we've picked up already in the earlier scene the issue, right, about the Sabbath and its purpose, and about the real heart of the law to a certain extent. It's supposed to be about giving life, etc. So we revisit this question again, right? What is the purpose of the Sabbath? And I think it'd be fair to say here that Sabbath functions, in some ways as like a catch-all for the law, maybe as a whole, in part because of how important the Sabbath was. There's some scholars who would argue, Jewish and Christian, who would argue that the pinnacle of the law was precisely Sabbath. So Sabbath carries more weight than just observance. Again, you can find examples, and I think this is kind of interesting. You can actually find examples of Jesus's position that's enunciated here among rabbis that are relatively close contemporaries. Like we can find some of this in Talmudic writings that are somewhat around the time. So this is not super controversial per se, because there would be others, but of course it is unique to who Jesus is. And what's the answer? The answer is the one that we've heard all along, right? The answer, the purpose of the Sabbath, the purpose of the law, and of course the purpose of Jubilee, which Jesus has kind of used to frame the whole of his ministry, is to give life, right? That's what God is interested in, is giving life, and is interested in not just any kind of life. And I think this is important. It's not just bare existence that God is interested in. And this is where, when we use the kind of word life, we need to think about this as flourishing life, right? Because this man's hand, this right hand, yeah, he lives, he's alive, but his status in his community is precarious. And so to have that hand restored means more than just having the hand restored. It means having his status, his ability to work, labor, and to be a major contributor and participant in his community. All of those things are included in that event, that act of restoration. So when we think about life, we're not just thinking about bare existence, we're talking about flourishing life. So the hand is restored, and as I've already mentioned, it means his restoration to his community. And of course, this fits in with the overall imagery that we've seen coming straight out of chapter 4, right? That Jesus is the one who is anointed by the Spirit to proclaim liberty to the captives, right? To set free those who are enslaved, to bring healing, to restore the sight of the blind, etc., to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. I mean, that's essentially, this fits in that sense with this larger set of themes that we've seen. Well, then we get this response, right? So now in verse 11, right? This is the first time, again, we start to hear that intensification of anger. Verse 11, but they were filled with fury and discussed with one another what they might do to Jesus. And I think there's actually in another of the Gospels, it's like they start talking about how they're going to kill him or how they're going to destroy him, is the language that they use. But it's the same basic idea. So you can actually translate the fury here with like senselessness, like they literally lose their mind because of what Jesus does. So looking back to Simeon, we heard that this was going to happen, and now it's starting to happen, and it fits, right? This fits as a potential possibility or expression. It looks, I think somebody's talking there in the background. I'm trying to mute there, but it's not working. It fits in again with that imagery of new wine and old wineskins, right? That old wineskins bursting. And I think here we have some sort of a sense about what that might look like. All right, so let me stop there for a second. I'm kind of rambling a little bit and see what kind of comments or thoughts that you have
Can I make a comment?
on this piece. I'm going to stop share my screen so we can all see each other. Thoughts, comments, questions? What does this provoke for you inside?
Keep rambling.
Anybody? I hit the mute button for folks. Yeah.
What is the sentence, Jesus is the prophet who inaugurates Jubilee, mean?
It goes back to chapter 4, right, where Jesus, he starts out his ministry by quoting Isaiah, and the imagery that Isaiah uses is the imagery of the Jubilee year. And so Jesus has been portrayed as a prophetic figure, prophet, and his ministry is about inaugurating this Jubilee, right? The year of the Lord's favor. So the language of Jubilee is rooted in the Old Testament. In Leviticus 25 is the first place that we encounter it. And then the prophets take it over, especially the prophet Isaiah, and it becomes a way of talking about not only the prescriptions in Leviticus, which were basically what Leviticus says is every 50 years, we're going to do a social reset. right? The people who have had to sell their land because they fell into debt, either if they fell into debt for legitimate reasons or for bad reasons, right? Doesn't matter. If they've lost the land, then they've lost their stake in what it means to be a people. We're going to set them free of their debts. We're going to return their land to them. We're going to keep power, wealth, etc., from being concentrated into too few hands and kind of redistribute it to a certain extent. Not making it absolute equal, but making it relatively more equal, I think is one way of thinking about it. And this was understood to be a moment of sort of a social reset, because it also occurs, it starts on the Day of Atonement. So it's not disconnected from forgiving sins and confessing sins, right? Then the prophets pick it up, Isaiah picks it up, and it becomes a way of talking about what God as a whole is interested in doing for creation and for Israel and ultimately for humanity as a whole. And that is setting free the captives, right? We are all captive in a certain sense. So it has to do with, of course, being set free from sin, but also from the bondages that our sins create in this world, right? The fact that we keep people from having access to life, etc. So those kinds of things, right? So an end to warfare, an end to famine, an end to disease. All those things are sort of wrapped up. So Jesus picks up this text in Luke chapter 4, he reads it, and he says that this is fulfilled now in your hearing. And he's not just saying about that day, he's saying the now language that he used there, it can be, I think, applied to the whole of his ministry. And so right after chapter 4, that section, we move into the next passages in the second half of chapter 4 into chapter 5. And what is Jesus doing? He's healing people. He's setting people who are possessed free, right? He's giving sight to the blind. So he's doing all the things that he said he was going to do in that chapter. So that's what I mean. This fits even here. It shows that there is, in a sense, no boundary to what to God's kind of healing power, jubilee power. Even the boundary that it would seem to be set up by the Sabbath is not a boundary. At least that would be one way I would read that. Does that help? Is that helpful?
Yes.
Okay.
Did you give the definition of the novium, or how that word was that you talked about? I didn't get that. The novium
Yeah.
of the kingdom.
Yeah, so that word novum it's a Latin word, and it simply is meant to connote the newness.
Oh, newness. Okay.
Radical newness of the kingdom, right? And
Okay.
it's and the newness also, it carries a connotation of unique with it.
Okay.
So the kingdom that Jesus brings, and this is not, we don't want to discount its connection to the Old Testament,
Mm-hmm.
but it's also a radically new thing.
Okay.
Right.
Okay.
Other comments or questions? It's never good when I've stunned you into silence. I don't think that's good.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Well, I will. I tell you what. We'll end today. I'll say a word of prayer, but I do. I hope that you have a great week, and I look forward to us revisiting and returning together next week. I'll send out materials for you. I did want to say, if you're interested, we're going to have a sort of Christianity 101 class. It's going to be starting this week. We're going to launch it on Wednesday night, and it's going to be led by our adult education intern, Joe Worden. I'll be present for it. We're hoping it will be conversational. It's sort of the first time we're going to try it out, and then we're going to figure out what the bugs are, and then we're going to come back and do it again in April. So would love to see you if you're available. I'll send out information for that as well in an email. If you're part of the mailing, if you've been getting these outlines, you'll receive information for that as well a little later today. So with that, let me close this.
Christian, one thing, is
Yeah.
there a spot where we could get back lessons earlier lessons? Is it like in the colonial group?
Earlier lessons, what do you mean?
From
Bible study?
yeah.
Yes,
Um,
absolutely. You can. So there's two things you can do. One is all of these have been recorded on YouTube. So if you go to YouTube and you go to the Colonial Church channel, you can just type it in Colonial Church, and that'll take you to our webpage, and you hit on videos, and it'll give you all of the things that are available, and you can just kind of scroll through there and you'll find them. And then if you want the outlines,
mhm.
you go onto the Colonial website and you go into the My Colonial section,
Right.
and each of you are in the group. So if you go to your actual page, it'll have a group, you'll have a series of groups that you're in. If you click on the group, you go to our group, and then there's a section called Files, and you can find all the outlines there.
Thank you.
All right. Absolutely. All right, let me say a quick word of prayer.